Oh, every year around this time I see a lot of people, usually white people, compare Malcolm X to Magneto and Dr. Martin Luther King to Professor X. And that is a comparison that I think is cool because it means that people understand that the X-Men, at its core, is about social justice and equality. Yes, cool powers and tight-fitting costumes, but also explicitly about fighting for a world that hates and fears you for who you are, despite being hated by the world. But other than that comparison, that is Martin Luther King to Professor X and Malcolm X to Magneto, couldn't be more entirely wrong. Stay with me. I'm Dan Umpton, and this is the Doomcast. Hey, thanks a lot for watching, but before we go any further, please do me a favor and click subscribe and hit the bell. If you like comics, if you like the history of comics, you're going to like this channel. I put out about one video a week, and they're all great, so do me a favor, hit that subscribe. Thanks. Comics have always been political, from the time that Cap first punched Hitler in the face, and they've almost always fallen predominantly left of center, although I acknowledge that Steve Ditko, talented as he was, and Comicsgate still exist. But Stan Lee was pretty progressive, but not quite that progressive. The X-Men were called X in that they had extra powers, supposedly. How dumb is that? Anyway, Lee and Kirby were still definitely a little more left-leaning people, but the X-Men cumulatively across their publication history has been a metaphor for social justice movements. That's inarguable. But the comparison of Charles Xavier and Magneto to MLK and Malcolm X respectively is terrible for a number of reasons. Firstly, it misunderstands how revolutionary and radical Martin Luther King Jr. was, and it misunderstands both Magneto and Malcolm X. White people have been talking about what Martin Luther King thought since Martin Luther King passed from this earth, and they've been doing a great job of getting it wrong. Anyhow, Professor X is thought of by non-comic geeks as a kindly, well-meaning neoliberal centrist who believes in working within a system to bring about change, like stopping anti-mutant senators from being assassinated and stuff, and thereby proving to the world that they should have the ability to exist equally. Comic geeks remember Professor X as being a pretty manipulative, egocentric, wealthy neoliberal guy who conscripted child soldiers into a war against a guy with a helmet that looks like a bucket. In fact, multiple guys in his team had helmets with buckets, and there was one guy with a really weird tongue. He turned his twin sister into a supervillain, and he turned his negative thoughts and ego into a supervillain. All around, not a great guy. Anyway, Dr. Martin Luther King didn't believe in working within a system. Let's say that again. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't believe in working strictly within a system. He was pro-riot, he was pro-protest, he was pro-boycott, he was pro-disruption, as he was arrested 30 times. He stated that people cannot be satisfied until police brutality is ended, and quote, justice rolls down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream. King openly extolled the dismantling of capitalism, and that capitalism is tied to the systematic injustices of racism and economic exploitation, and in fact, relies on it, and he said that perhaps America should move to democratic socialism. Most of those things are direct quotes. Magneto wasn't always a conflicted Holocaust survivor with noble motives. In early Marvel, he was an Avengers villain who was incredibly abusive and disloyal, even to his allies, violent, egotistical, and bent on world domination, rather than mutant liberation strictly. In fact, you can credit Chris Claremont with most of the aspects that made Magneto and Xavier much more complex characters. Also, big shout-outs to Mike Carey, Cullen Bunn, and Jonathan Hickman for making him into more of an anti-hero than a villain quite strictly, or terrorist. Likewise, Malcolm X was not a terrorist, as Magneto certainly was when he started out. He was a devoted father and husband, a principled and disciplined man who also tied the evils of his day and ours to a system of racial and economic injustices that we call capitalism, but he was also just a wee bit more open about the fact that fighting a system was often going to be not so metaphorical. The comparison made between this very imperfect analogy is essentially this. The idea of Dr. King no longer scares white elites, and the idea of Malcolm X still does. Ergo, Professor X, the nice guy, and Magneto, the bad guy. But perhaps a better metaphor is that Martin Luther King is more like Magneto than you would want to admit, even. Without the pomp and the ego and the violence, perhaps, and maybe Malcolm X isn't enough like him either, a man probably more selfless, bookish, and gentle than history would like to remember. If anything, Martin Luther King is like Storm. Probably white people like her, but she doesn't really like you that much, and she's low-key down to wreck you if she's got to protect her people. Malcolm X might be closer to Cyclops, a little bit tougher talk and a little scarier, but still pretty even keel, and also the glasses. Maybe Magneto is closer to Huey P. Newton? I don't know if that means that Bobby Seale's like Apocalypse, or like, I feel like the metaphor breaks down real quickly if you start going any farther with that. Regardless, comics, especially the X-Men, have always been political, will continue to be political. And whether the metaphor is racial, sexual, or gender identity, mutants are a stand-in for oppressed people all over the world. And hopefully, they always will be, until that oppression is no longer existent. Thanks everybody for watching. This has been the Doomcast. I will see you next week.